taxes were somehow absolutely necessary for the good of the realm. Despite their limited influence, they were vital to feudal stability. They formed the backbone of local governance, filling in the gaps that higher nobles ignored. They kept the roads safe, ensured tithes reached the right hands, and served as the first line of defense when raiders appeared on the horizon. Lesser nobles didn't shape kingdoms, but they shaped everyday life. They were the foot soldiers of aristocracy, the quiet administrators, the local authorities who kept the medieval world turning even when no one bothered to thank them. They weren't mighty, they weren't powerless, they were essential. If medieval society were a grand, glittering tapestry of nobility, then sergeants and household officers were the strong, stubborn threads holding the whole thing together. These men weren't nobles in the glamorous sense. They didn't host feasts, own vast duchies, or march around in gold-trimmed cloaks. Instead, they were the professional class of medieval power, trained fighters, administrators, and specialists who made noble households function with something resembling order. A sergeant wasn't a knight, but he was also definitely not a random peasant with a stick. Think of him as the medieval equivalent of a highly skilled contractor. Some sergeants were well-trained soldiers responsible for defending castles, patrolling borders, and backing up knights in battle. They carried spears, crossbows, or swords, wore decent armour, and did all the dangerous work knights preferred to delegate when possible. A knight might ride gloriously into battle. A sergeant held the line, took the hits, and made sure things didn't collapse. Other sergeants were specialists: castle gatekeepers, bridge wardens, messengers, mounted couriers, and professional guards trusted with keys to rooms full of things nobles didn't want stolen. They were the men nobles relied on when they needed something done reliably, especially tasks that required less bragging and more competence. Then there were the household officers, the administrators who actually kept noble households from devolving into chaos. The steward oversaw finances and estate management. The marshal handled stables and military organisation. The bailiff enforced local laws and collected rents, often while being shouted at by angry villagers. And the chamberlain managed the lord's private quarters, essentially functioning as the medieval personal assistant with keys to everything, including secrets. These officers didn't wield power through birthright, but through expertise. A good steward could increase a baron's wealth more than a dozen tax edicts. A competent marshal could turn a ragtag militia into a functioning defence force. A trusted chamberlain could whisper information that changed political outcomes, and nobles knew their worth. Many household officers earned enough respect to secure comfortable lives, sometimes even receiving small land grants. Some rose high enough for their children to join the lower ranks of nobility. They lived in a strange limbo, respected, relied upon, yet not quite noble. They were the glue, the gears, the quiet professionals who kept the realm functioning. Knights may have charged into glory, dukes may have schemed in castles, but sergeants and officers kept the entire machine from collapsing every single day. They were the Middle Ages' unsung professionals, steady, skilled, and absolutely essential. By the time you reach the bottom of the noble ladder, you realize something important. Medieval society wasn't a pyramid. It wasn't even a ladder. It was a spider web, sticky, fragile, interdependent, and populated by creatures that all secretly wanted to eat each other. Every rank relied on the others, and every rank feared the others. The king feared rebellion. Dukes feared kings. Counts feared dukes. Barons feared taxes. Knights feared dishonour. Lesser nobles feared poverty. Sergeants feared everyone. And peasants? Well, peasants feared wolves, famine, taxes, and waking up to discover someone had declared war again. This web was not built on trust. It was built on obligation. A noble's survival depended on fulfilling duties, swearing loyalty upward, offering protection downward, and hoping sideways alliances didn't explode. Feudal bonds were made through oaths thick enough to feel sacred but flexible enough to be broken when convenient. A count swore loyalty to his king until the king angered him. A baron promised support to his lord unless a better offer arrived. Chivalry and honour were the official rules. Opportunism was the actual rule-book. Land was the currency of power. Every acre held value, not just economically but symbolically. Owning land meant having peasants. Peasants meant taxes. Taxes meant soldiers. Soldiers meant leverage. And leverage meant the king had to smile politely when you entered his hall instead of throwing you into a dungeon. But for all its flaws, feudalism worked. Or at least, it worked as well as any system designed in an era where bathing was considered optional. The ranks of nobility functioned like gears in a massive machine. Kings issued laws that dukes ignored, that counts interpreted, that barons enforced, that knights carried out, that lesser nobles supervised, and that sergeants executed. Everyone played a part, unwillingly or not. Power flowed downward in the form of commands. Responsibility flowed upward in the form of taxes, military service, and endless apologies. A single insult could trigger a feud. A single marriage could rewrite a political map. The entire system depended on carefully balanced relationships. Loyalty mixed with suspicion, duty mixed with ambition, fear mixed with pride. In the end, the medieval world wasn't defined by kings or castles. It was defined by relationships, a constant negotiation of status, honour, and survival. You weren't just born into a rank. You were born into a centuries-long argument over what that rank meant. And in that argument, every noble, from the king to the humblest household officer, played their role in the great chaotic theatre of medieval power. Hatshepsut entered the world with royalty in her blood and destiny stitched into her very name. As the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and his powerful queen, Ahmose, she was raised inside the palace walls, like someone who was never meant to live an ordinary life. In ancient Egypt, princes were groomed to inherit the throne. Princesses, not so much. Their job was to marry strategically and produce political stability. But Hatshepsut didn't behave like someone preparing for a ceremonial life spent in the shadow of men. Even as a child, she walked with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the throne was not just a possibility. It was her natural element. Egyptian royalty didn't receive a gentle upbringing, but Hatshepsut's education was intense even by palace standards. She learned hieroglyphics, mathematics, theology, and statecraft. She studied religious law and memorized sacred rituals normally reserved for future pharaohs. When she accompanied her father at ceremonies, she didn't just stand behind him, she observed. She listened. She absorbed every detail of leadership with a seriousness that made the old priests raise their eyebrows. Many in the palace began to whisper that she wasn't simply the king's daughter. She was the king's favourite student. Then came her politically convenient marriage to her half-brother, Thutmose II. It was standard practice for Egyptian royalty to marry within the family, but this union carried a deeper calculation. For the dynasty to remain pure, and for the throne to remain stable, Hatshepsut was the only suitable bride. Her marriage tied her even tighter to the future of Egypt. When she became great royal wife, her authority rose, but technically, she still had no claim to rule alone. But life had its own plans. When Thutmose II died young, the throne passed to a child, Thutmose III, a boy too young to rule. And suddenly, all eyes turned to Hatshepsut, not as a queen, but as a regent, a caretaker, a temporary stand-in for power. Except Hatshepsut didn't step in like a placeholder. She stepped in like a ruler who had been waiting her entire life for exactly this crack in the system. She had the bloodline, the education, and the political instincts. More importantly, she had the confidence of priests, scribes, and high officials, people who mattered far more than public opinion. The rules said a woman couldn't be pharaoh. Hatshepsut's entire childhood had prepared her to prove the rules wrong. When Thutmose II died and left only a young child as heir, the Egyptian court braced for instability. A kingdom as vast and wealthy as Egypt needed a steady hand, not a toddler with a ceremonial crown slipping over his eyes. So Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent, the adult meant to govern until Thutmose III grew old enough to rule. It sounded temporary, simple, and familiar. Many queens before her had served as regents during a prince's childhood, but Hatshepsut was not like the queens before her. She began her regency with calm competence. She performed rituals flawlessly, presided over administrative meetings, and stabilized a court shaken by the death of a pharaoh. Officials who expected a soft-spoken caretaker instead found someone who carried authority like a cloak thrown over her shoulders from birth. She spoke with confidence, made decisions quickly, and understood Egypt's complicated bureaucracy better than most men in the room. Within months, something became clear. Egypt wasn't just surviving under her leadership. It was thriving. That was when things started to shift. One title after another began attaching itself to her name. She took on responsibilities normally reserved for the pharaoh, not his stand-in. She appeared in royal ceremonies not behind the young king, but beside him. Slowly, subtly, she stepped into a position no woman was meant to occupy, and the court noticed. Priests, especially those of Amun, favoured her. They saw in her not just intelligence, but piety and political savvy. They whispered that perhaps the gods themselves approved of her stewardship high officials, who cared less about tradition and more about functioning government, supported her quietly. Egypt was stable, trade was flowing, and temples were being funded. Why rock the boat? But others watched with growing unease. A regent was supposed to fade away when the boy king came of age, not rise like the sun overtaking the sky. And yet Hatshepsut's presence grew larger, her influence heavier. She acted not like a placeholder, but like someone preparing Egypt for a new kind of leadership. By her 7th year as regent, the transformation was complete. Hatshepsut no longer stood beside the throne. She sat on it. She did the unthinkable. She declared herself pharaoh, not queen regent. Pharaoh in full title, full authority, and full divine legitimacy. Egypt now had a woman not just holding power, but claiming it outright. And she had no intention of giving it back. When Hatshepsut finally declared herself pharaoh, it wasn't a moment of impulsive ambition. It was a masterclass in political engineering, religious symbolism, and psychological strategy. No woman before her had dared to claim the full throne of Egypt, not as queen, not as regent, but as pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, the divine ruler. Hatshepsut knew this was unprecedented. She also knew it was necessary. Egypt couldn't afford uncertainty. Long-distance trade routes needed protection. Temples needed patrons. Bureaucracies needed leadership. And frankly, the boy king Thutmose III was still far too young to carry the weight of an empire that spanned deserts, deltas, and foreign borders. Hatshepsut didn't seize power from chaos. She seized it from a vacuum, but she also understood the danger. Even the idea of a female pharaoh threatened the entire ideological backbone of Egypt. Pharaohs weren't just rulers. They were the male earthly forms of gods. To break that tradition required more than boldness. It required myth-making. So she forged a new narrative. In temple inscriptions and carved reliefs, she declared that her father, Thutmose I, had personally chosen her as his successor. Priests circulated stories claiming that the god Amun himself had visited Hatshepsut's mother in disguise, foretelling her divine birth. These weren't lies. They were strategies Egypt ran on symbolism, and Hatshepsut used it like a weapon. Then came the transformation of her public image. She began appearing in the full regalia of a pharaoh, the Nemes headdress, the Shendit kilt, and most shockingly, the ceremonial beard. She wasn't pretending to be a man. She was embodying kingship in its symbolic form. In Egyptian thought, the role mattered more than the body that filled it. Still, she didn't erase her femininity entirely. In some statues, she appears as a woman in a tight-fitting gown. In others, she appears with masculine features and bare chest, like a traditional king. She crafted a fluid identity, part queen, part king, fully pharaoh. It was political brilliance disguised as religious obedience. The court watched. Some quietly supported her, Others whispered, waited, and sharpened their doubts like knives. But no one could deny the truth. Egypt ran better under Hatshepsut than it had in years. Becoming pharaoh wasn't rebellion. It was evolution. She wasn't stealing the throne. She was stepping into a role she believed destiny had prepared her for since childhood. And Egypt, surprisingly, seemed ready to follow. Once Hatshepsut claimed the throne, she faced her greatest challenge: convincing an entire civilization that a woman could embody a role traditionally reserved for men. Egypt wasn't just sexist by culture, it was sexist by theology. The pharaoh wasn't merely a political leader. He was Horus incarnate, the divine son of Osiris. The imagery, the rituals, the titles, everything was built on masculine symbolism. Hatshepsut didn't try to erase this structure. She outsmarted it. Her strategy hinged on one idea. Identity in Egypt was performance, and anyone who could perform kingship convincingly could be king, so she crafted a new visual language for herself. In statues, she appeared with the traditional kilt, broad chest, and the iconic false beard worn by male pharaohs. It wasn't a disguise, it was a costume, like a modern judge's robe or a monarch's crown. It signaled legitimacy, continuity, and sacred authority. Priests understood it. Officials understood it. Even commoners understood it. When the figure looked like a pharaoh, wore the crown of a pharaoh, and spoke with the authority of a pharaoh, then it was a pharaoh. Yet Hatshepsut didn't erase her womanhood. She allowed duality. In some reliefs, she appears fully feminine, wearing the clinging sheath dress of royal women. In others, her body is stylized into masculine ideals: broad shoulders, angular jaw, powerful posture. This was not confusion. It was strategy. She offered her audience options. Traditionalists could cling to the male-coded imagery. Progressives could accept her as a powerful woman. Everyone found something to support. Her greatest innovation was merging these two identities into a seamless narrative. Instead of choosing male ruler or female ruler, she became both at once, the daughter of a pharaoh and the chosen successor of the gods. The body didn't matter. The role did. And her choice of the beard, one of the most iconic symbols of Egyptian kingship, became her signature. It wasn't attached with glue, it was carved in stone. A message, a declaration, a redefinition of power. It said, "I am Pharaoh because I wear what pharaohs wear, do what pharaohs do, and command what pharaohs command." The court could whisper, the nobles could pretend to frown. But when her statues appeared in temples across Egypt, towering, serene, unmistakably royal, the message was clear. Hatshepsut had not broken tradition. She had absorbed it, remolded it, and made it entirely her own. She didn't hide behind masculinity. She weaponized it. If claiming the throne was Hatshepsut's boldest move, building was her loudest. She understood something fundamental about Egypt. Rulers lived or died not by gossip or court politics, but by stone. A pharaoh's monuments were their voice across millennia. The weak left nothing. The strong carved their names into the bones of the earth Hatshepsut intended to be remembered. Her architectural reign exploded with ambition. She ordered new constructions everywhere: temples, shrines, obelisks, chapels, statues. It was as if Egypt itself had woken from sleep and begun expanding. And at the center of this building, frenzy stood her masterpiece, Djeser, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Imagine an ancient wonder built into the cliffs of Thebes, terraces rising like steps to the heavens, columns lined in perfect symmetry, ramps leading up to sanctuaries glowing with incense and the colors of the gods. It wasn't just a temple. It was a declaration, a statement crafted in limestone. I am Pharaoh. I am timeless. Her architects, led by her loyal official Senenmut, designed the complex with mathematical precision and breathtaking elegance. Reliefs inside told stories of her divine birth, her coronation, and her deeds. A political campaign carved in stone rather than shouted in court. And unlike other rulers whose monuments screamed conquest, Hatshepsut's temple emphasized harmony, religion, and prosperity. It reflected her reign, calm, stable, and undeniably grand. But Djeser was only the crown jewel. Hatshepsut also revitalized the Temple of Karnak, one of Egypt's holiest sites. She erected towering obelisks. Massive spires of rose granite dragged hundreds of miles from Aswan. One of her obelisks still stands today, catching sunlight just as she intended over 3,000 years ago. These weren't mere monuments, they were political anchors. Every stone reminded Egyptians that her rule was sanctioned by the gods, prosperous in practice and rooted in tradition. Her building projects also employed thousands, stimulating the economy and spreading wealth among artisans, labourers and priests. Temples meant offerings. Offerings meant jobs. Jobs meant loyalty. Through construction, Hatshepsut didn't just build monuments, she built support. In a kingdom where kings proved their power through war, Hatshepsut proved hers through creation. Her legacy rose from quarries and desert sands, challenging centuries of masculine rule not by force, but by scale, beauty, and permanence. She reshaped Egypt's skyline. She reshaped Egypt's memory. And with every stone, she ensured that history could never easily erase her, even if her enemies would try. If Hatshepsut's monuments were her voice in stone, the Punt expedition was her voice carried across oceans. Every pharaoh before her had dreamed of reaching Punt, the land of the gods, a mysterious realm rich in incense, gold, ebony, exotic animals, and wonders whispered about in temple halls. But Hatshepsut did more than dream. She launched one of the greatest trade expeditions in ancient Egyptian history, an undertaking so bold it was carved across her temple walls as a triumph equal to any military conquest. Egypt was powerful, but it craved certain luxuries only Punt could offer, especially myrrh, the sacred incense used in rituals, medicine, and embalming. Myrrh wasn't just valuable, it was divine currency. Controlling its flow meant controlling religious legitimacy itself. Hatshepsut understood that trade could achieve what armies could not, and she was determined to secure wealth without spilling blood. Under her orders, a fleet of large, sleek ships was constructed at the Nile docks. These weren't simple fishing vessels. They were ocean-worthy craft capable of crossing the Red Sea, a logistical achievement that required skilled sailors, carpenters, navigators, and translators. Imagine a convoy of gilded ships slicing through the water, sails full, the horizon shimmering with heat and possibility. When her expedition reached Punt, the Egyptians were welcomed like honoured guests. Hatshepsut's reliefs show scenes of abundance, trees heavy with incense resin, piles of gold rings, exotic animals, and even the famously rotund Queen of Punt, who appears in the carvings with exaggerated features, one of the most recognisable figures in Egyptian art. The imagery is almost boastful, as if to declare, "Look what diplomacy achieved, no war, no blood, only prosperity." What returned to Egypt was astonishing. Shiploads of myrrh saplings to plant in Egypt's soil, a first in Egyptian history. Exotic goods that dazzled nobles and priests. Livestock and rare animals that enriched temple offerings. And most importantly, prestige. A ruler who could secure Punt's wealth was not merely competent, she was divinely favoured. Hatshepsut even had the scenes immortalised on the walls of Djeser, turning the entire event into a PR masterpiece carved for eternity. The message was unmistakable. While other pharaohs conquered neighbours, she connected worlds. The expedition wasn't just about trade, it was about legitimacy, about proving that her reign brought prosperity, stability, and divine blessing. Hatshepsut didn't need a battlefield to demonstrate greatness. She needed ships, and the courage to send them beyond the horizon. While Hatshepsut ruled Egypt with confidence and unmatched stability, one figure stood just slightly behind her, watching, learning, waiting. Thutmose III, the boy king who was pharaoh in name long before he had any real power, grew up under the long shadow of his stepmother's extraordinary reign. To the outside world, he appeared obedient and quiet, but inside the palace, inside his young mind, a transformation was brewing. When Hatshepsut first became regent, Thutmose III was too young to care. The throne meant little to a child more fascinated by chariots, hunting birds, and palace pets. But as he grew older, the political landscape began to reshape the way he saw himself. He wasn't just a prince. He was supposed to be Pharaoh, the sole ruler, the divine embodiment of Horus. Yet every temple relief, every obelisk, every proclamation declared Hatshepsut as the ruling pharaoh. She wasn't preparing him for rule. She was ruling in his place. Still, Hatshepsut didn't mistreat him or undermine him publicly. She ensured he received a prince's education, military training, religious instruction, diplomatic etiquette. She made him commander of the armies at a young age, a gesture that looked generous on the surface but was also politically clever. A military title satisfied tradition, but it kept him busy, far from court politics. Meanwhile, her own loyal officials, especially Senenmut, filled the administrative vacuum around her. Thutmose found himself surrounded by adults who owed their careers to her. For a young heir, this wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating. Imagine being told from birth that you were destined to rule the mightiest kingdom on earth, only to watch someone else, someone outside the traditional line, wear the crown, give the orders, receive the praise, and carve her legacy into stone. Every year that passed strengthened her claim and weakened his. But Thutmose was patient. He studied Egypt's bureaucratic machinery. He learned the army inside out. He observed the priests, the nobles, the officials, and he remembered who supported her and who didn't. Hatshepsut's reign made Egypt wealthy, stable, and powerful, but it also left a trail of political resentments, quiet rivalries, and personal frustrations. And Thutmose III, growing from boy to young man, took note of every one of them. He didn't challenge her. He didn't rebel. He simply waited, because he knew that time, something even a pharaoh cannot control, was on his side, and when that time arrived, the consequences would reshape everything. When Hatshepsut died, peacefully it seems, around middle age, Egypt didn't erupt into chaos. There was no rebellion, no civil war, no dramatic struggle for the throne. The transition was seamless. Thutmose III, now a fully grown and battle-tested man, simply stepped into full power. But what came next was not a gentle succession. It was a calculated rewriting of history, executed with the precision of a military campaign. Years after her death, not immediately, but deliberately, Thutmose began erasing Hatshepsut from the record. This was not impulsive rage. This was methodical. Her statues were ripped from their pedestals and smashed. Her cartouches, the sacred name rings that guaranteed eternal life, were chiselled off walls, scraped away until nothing remained but faint outlines. Her images in reliefs were replaced with those of Thutmose's own family. In some places, workers carved crude blocks where her figure once stood, like scars left in stone. Her monumental temple at Deir el-Bahari escaped total destruction. Fortunately, it was too massive and too sacred to demolish, but many of her inscriptions were defaced, her titles struck out, her likenesses hammered away. It was as though the kingdom wanted to pretend she had never existed. But why? Historians debate this endlessly. Was it revenge? Jealousy? A political purge? Or something far more strategic? The most accepted explanation is this. Thutmose III needed to re-establish the traditional, male-only lineage of kingship. Having a successful female pharaoh in the royal line risked encouraging other powerful women, or rival claimants, to attempt the same. By erasing her, he restored the image of unbroken male rule Egypt, after all, depended heavily on stability, ritual, and continuity. A single deviation, even a successful one, threatened the narrative that pharaohs were divine, unchanging, eternally male. Another possibility is personal. Thutmose spent his youth overshadowed by Hatshepsut. Her achievements dwarfed his early years, her monuments outshining anything he had built at the time. Removing her legacy may have been a way to reclaim the throne that he felt had been denied to him, not by violence, but by brilliance. And yet, oddly enough, he didn't erase everything. He left some of her obelisks standing, sometimes simply building walls around them. He did not desecrate her burial. His actions were political, not spiteful. Ironically, the attempt to erase her only made her more fascinating to later historians. The scars, the gaps, the ghostly outlines on temple walls, these became clues Thutmose may have tried to silence her, but his chisels ended up whispering her name across time. And today, Hatshepsut is remembered not as a footnote, but as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. For centuries after her death, Hatshepsut existed as a ghost in Egyptian history, erased from king lists, overwritten in temple inscriptions, and buried beneath the political narrative that only men could rule as pharaoh tourists in ancient times walked past her monuments without knowing her name. Priests recited hymns in halls she built without acknowledging the queen who commissioned them. Her story lay hidden beneath layers of chiseled stone, forgotten intentionally and successfully for a time. But history has a way of protecting the extraordinary. In the 19th century, when European archaeologists began unearthing the ruins of ancient Egypt, they started noticing something strange. A pattern of missing names and defaced images clustered around the reign of Thutmose. The third, inscriptions looked oddly incomplete. Statues appeared vandalized in a consistent, systematic way, and in one temple, a massive set of monuments seemed to belong to a pharaoh, whose name had been erased repeatedly, but whose achievements were unmistakable. Something, or someone, had been hidden. Then came the discovery at Deir el-Bahari. As archaeologists cleared sand from the terraces of a grand mortuary temple, unlike anything else in Egypt, they began reading the surviving inscriptions. There, carved into the very architecture of the cliffs, was a story of divine birth, royal legitimacy, and triumphant rule. The name was missing in many places, but enough remained to identify her. Hatshepsut, the woman pharaoh. Piece by piece, researchers reconstructed her reign. Her trade expeditions to Punt, her building projects, her bold claim to kingship, her years of peace and prosperity. The more they uncovered, the clearer the truth became. Egypt under Hatshepsut was strong, stable, wealthy, and innovative. She was not a usurper. She was a visionary. Suddenly those chiselled-out cartouches and defaced statues didn't represent failure. They represented fear. Fear of her success. Fear of her precedent. Fear that her story, if left intact, would challenge the very foundations of pharaonic tradition. And in a poetic twist, that fear ensured her resurrection. The erasures created a mystery. The mystery drew attention, and attention dragged her back into the light. Today, Hatshepsut stands not as an anomaly, but as a testament to what leadership looks like when ambition meets intelligence, diplomacy meets strategy, and power meets purpose. She proved that kingship was not a gender, it was a role, a burden, and a vision. Her monuments still rise from the desert. Her obelisks still catch the sun. Her story, once silenced, now roars across history. Hatshepsut didn't just rule Egypt. She rewrote what a pharaoh could be. England in the mid-15th century wasn't a stable kingdom. It was a pressure cooker about to explode. On paper, the country had a king, a court, and a functioning government. In reality, everything depended on one fragile man, King Henry VI, a ruler so gentle, so passive, and so tragically unfit for power that the crown seemed heavier on him than on any monarch before Henry preferred prayer over politics, charity over strategy, and peace over strength. That might sound admirable, but in the medieval world, a king who couldn't project dominance might as well have handed his sword to the nearest ambitious noble, and England had ambitious nobles in abundance. The country was still licking its wounds from the 100 Years' War. Armies were returning home unemployed, angry and heavily armed. Taxes were rising, local conflicts were erupting. And most importantly, the throne itself looked shockingly vulnerable. Henry suffered terrifying bouts of mental collapse, periods when he could not speak, could not recognize his wife, and could not comprehend that he was king at all. During these episodes, England had no pilot at the helm. Power rushed into the vacuum. At the centre of this storm were two royal houses, both descended from King Edward III, and both convinced they were the rightful rulers of England. The House of Lancaster, marked by the red rose, held the throne through Henry VI. Their power rested on tradition, loyalty, and the fierce will of Henry's French-born queen, Margaret of Anjou, a woman far tougher and more politically calculating than her husband ever hoped to be. Opposing them stood the House of York, symbolised by the white rose and led by Richard, Duke of York. Richard wasn't just ambitious. He was competent. He had blood claim, battlefield experience, and a network of allies who believed England deserved a king who could actually rule. For years, tensions simmered, parliamentary disputes, whispered insults, alliances forming in candlelit chambers. But everything escalated when Henry fell into a near catatonic state, and Richard of York was appointed protector of the realm. Suddenly, England had something it hadn't seen in years: strong leadership. Many nobles liked it. Queen Margaret did not. She saw Richard not as a temporary caretaker, but as the man poised to steal her son's future. The political feud became personal, then poisonous, then uncontrollable. Loyalties began shifting like the tide. Families armed themselves, castles stocked provisions. Everyone sensed what was coming. England was no longer a kingdom, it was tinder, waiting for a spark. The spark finally ignited on a warm day in May 1455, in the quiet market town of St. Albans, a place that had seen more wool trading than warfare. No one expected history to explode in its narrow streets. But this was where England's simmering political feud turned into open war. Richard, Duke of York, marched towards St. Albans with a clear demand. He wanted to confront the Lancastrian lords who had blocked his rise and poisoned his reputation at court. He insisted he had no intention of harming King Henry VI. All he wanted, he claimed, was justice. The Lancastrian lords, especially the powerful and stubborn Duke of Somerset, dismissed these demands entirely. They believed York was positioning himself to take the crown. Negotiations collapsed within hours. Both armies were small by medieval standards, barely a few thousand men total, but their hatred was enormous. The Lancastrians barricaded themselves inside the town, confident that York wouldn't dare attack with the king present. They severely misjudged the moment. York's forces stormed the barricades. Fighting spilled through the streets, past market stalls and timber-framed homes. This wasn't the chivalric spectacle England loved to romanticize. It was personal, savage, and shockingly close quarters. Noblemen who had once dined together now hacked at one another in alleyways barely wide enough for two horses to pass. The turning point came when York's men found a weak spot in the defensive lines and pushed straight into the heart of the town. In the chaos, several key Lancastrian nobles were cornered and cut down, including the Duke of Somerset, York's most bitter rival. The symbolism was unmistakable. St. Albans wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Meanwhile, King Henry himself was caught in the crossfire. Wounded by an arrow in the face, he was discovered cowering in a tanner's shop, trembling and confused. York's men approached him not with hostility, but with theatrical respect. They dressed his wound, bowed deeply, and escorted him to York's camp. It was a chilling display. York had protected the king, after defeating the king's army. When the dust settled, York stood as the most powerful man in England. He claimed he fought only to remove evil counsellors, not to seize the crown. But everyone saw the truth behind the polite phrasing. The first blood had been spilled, the first noble heads had fallen, and England understood, with icy clarity, that this was no mere feud. It was the beginning of a war that would swallow a generation. After St. Albans, England entered a twilight state. Neither peace nor full war, but a tense, brittle calm held together by fear and formality. Richard of York had won the battle and eliminated his rivals, yet he still insisted he acted only to protect King Henry VI. But England was not fooled. A king who could barely string sentences together was not running the country. York was. Henry's mental fragility became impossible to hide. Sometimes he wandered aimlessly. Sometimes he stared blankly, unable to respond. Sometimes he simply shut down. England effectively had a king in name only, and when a kingdom has a crown with no mind behind it, power moves sideways, into the hands of those bold enough to grasp it. But if Richard of York expected smooth sailing, he underestimated one person, Queen Margaret of Anjou. Margaret saw the truth clearly. York wasn't just protecting Henry, he was positioning himself to steal her son's inheritance. And Margaret was not a passive medieval wife. She was fierce, politically razor-sharp, and utterly unwilling to let her child become a footnote in York's story. While Henry drifted in and out of lucidity, Margaret became the Lancastrian war engine. She rallied northern nobles, forged alliances, promised lands and titles, and stirred loyalty with fiery speeches. Nobles who hesitated to follow a fragile king found new strength under a queen who refused to surrender. Meanwhile, York's power grew. He was appointed protector again, effectively acting king in everything but name. He controlled the government, commanded the military, and wielded more practical authority than the monarch himself. But the more control he seized, the more the lines blurred between protector and usurper. England split down the middle. In the north and west, the Red Rose of Lancaster gained momentum under Margaret's leadership. Hardened warriors, local clans, and loyal magnates rallied to her cause. In the south and east, the White Rose of York thrived. Wealthy merchants, ambitious nobles, and veteran commanders saw York as the future. Every noble household was forced to choose a side. Some chose out of loyalty. Others chose out of fear. Many chose out of convenience, and nearly all would change sides before the war was over. By the late 1450s, England was a tinderbox again. Margaret built armies. York prepared defences. Everywhere, men sharpened weapons, prayed, and waited. The uneasy calm after St. Albans wasn't peace. It was the long inhale before England screamed. By 1461, the War of the Roses had transformed from a noble feud into a national nightmare. Alliances had shifted, armies had grown, and England's countryside was scarred by marching boots and burned villages. The fragile balance between Lancaster and York shattered completely when Richard of York was killed at Wakefield, his head displayed on a spike, mockingly crowned with paper. But York's death didn't break his cause, it lit it on fire. His 17-year-old son, Edward, Earl of March, took up the White Rose with a force that shocked even seasoned commanders. Tall, charismatic, and fearless, Edward galvanised Yorkist support instantly. Within weeks, he marched toward London, seized the capital, and declared himself King Edward IV, even though the Lancastrians still held the reigning king, Henry VI, in their camp. The stage was set for the battle that would define the war. On March 29th, 1461, near the village of Towton, two colossal armies, up to 60,000 men combined, met on a frozen field during a ferocious blizzard. Snow blew horizontally. The wind howled, and yet both sides advanced, knowing the crown itself depended on the outcome. The opening volleys of arrows were brutal. The Yorkists, fighting with the wind at their backs, fired farther and harder. Lancaster's arrows, pushed back by icy gusts, fell short. Useless. As their ammunition dwindled, the Lancastrians charged, desperate to close the distance. What followed wasn't a battle. It was slaughter. The two forces collided in a massive melee that lasted for hours. Men slipped on blood-slick mud. Blades shattered on armour. Horses crashed into walls of infantry. Snow turned red. Towton became a grinding, merciless test of endurance, where even veterans felt fear in their bones. At one point, the Lancastrians pushed the Yorkists back, nearly breaking their line, until reinforcements arrived under the Duke of Norfolk, smashing into Lancaster's flank and turning the tide. Panic erupted. The Red Rose army began to crumble, and then came the rout. Lancastrian soldiers, exhausted and terrified, fled across the Cockbeck River, only to drown under the weight of their armour. Others were cut down on the frozen slopes, as Yorkist pursuit continued without mercy. When the sun set, bodies covered the field so densely that chroniclers claimed one could walk from one end to the other without touching the ground. Towton ended with a decisive Yorkist victory. Edward IV was king, not just in proclamation, but in blood. England had never seen a day so brutal, and it would never forget it. After Towton, Edward IV emerged not just as a victorious claimant, but as a king forged in fire. England, exhausted from years of instability, finally had a monarch who looked the part. Tall, imposing, charismatic, with the confidence of someone who had taken the crown with his own hands rather than inherited it. The Yorkist dream seemed complete, but dreams in medieval politics tended to rot quickly. Edward began his reign with strength. He rewarded loyal nobles, stabilised the treasury, and brought a sense of youthful energy to the court. For the first time in years, festivals returned, commerce revived, and London breathed a collective sigh of relief. Yet, beneath the surface, the kingdom was still a powder keg, and one man held the match. That man was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, better known as Warwick the Kingmaker. Warwick had been instrumental in putting Edward on the throne. His wealth, influence, and military power were so vast that he was practically England's co-ruler. For a time, the two men worked in harmony. Warwick forged alliances abroad while Edward consolidated support at home. But cracks appeared quickly, and pride widened them. Warwick wanted Edward to be a compliant king, a figurehead guided by Neville's strategy. Edward, however, was no puppet. He was young, ambitious, and stubborn. He made decisions that infuriated Warwick, most notably secretly marrying Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow with no foreign alliances and a large, hungry family. This single marriage detonated the political landscape. Warwick had been negotiating a royal match with France. Edward's impulsive wedding humiliated him. Worse, the rise of the Woodville family threatened Neville dominance at court. Warwick felt sidelined, disrespected, and betrayed by the very king he had helped create. So he did what any dangerous, disillusioned noble with an army might do. He switched sides. Warwick began clandestine talks with Margaret of Anjou, the fierce Lancastrian queen who had refused to die politically. A pact between Warwick and Margaret was unthinkable, yet perfectly logical. Both wanted Edward gone, both wanted their influence back, and both were willing to plunge England into chaos again to achieve it. The kingdom, briefly stable, began to wobble once more. Rumours of rebellion grew, loyalties shifted. Even Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, joined Warwick's conspiracy. Edward had won England at Towton, but keeping it would prove far harder. The war wasn't over, it was mutating. And the Kingmaker was about to make, and unmake, a king all over again. By the mid-1460s, England was once again a chessboard, and Warwick the Kingmaker was the player flipping the board. Once Edward IV's greatest ally, Warwick now saw himself pushed aside, overshadowed by the Woodville family, and ignored by the king he had created. Warwick wasn't a man built for irrelevance, he was a man built for crowns, chaos, and control. And so he chose war. Again, his first move was clever: undermine Edward's authority from within. Warwick spread rumours, manipulated noble grievances, and stoked resentment toward the Woodvilles. He painted the king as reckless, controlled by his wife's family, and unworthy of the crown won at Towton. Many nobles, jealous of the Woodvilles' sudden rise, listened. Then Warwick acted. In 1469, he and Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, launched open rebellion. Clarence, ambitious and perpetually insecure, thought Warwick could make him king instead. The alliance of convenience was poisonous, but effective. They captured Edward, seized control of the government, and executed several of the king's closest supporters. For a moment it looked as if the kingmaker had toppled his creation. But Warwick made one critical mistake. He couldn't govern without Edward nobles refused to recognise Clarence as a viable king. The country didn't rally behind Warwick's authority, and Edward, charming, confident, politically agile, still had the loyalty of London and key Yorkist supporters. Unable to maintain control, Warwick reluctantly released Edward. Edward regained power, but only briefly. Warwick and Clarence fled abroad to rethink their strategy. What they did next was unthinkable. They allied with Margaret of Anjou, the same Queen Warwick had spent years defeating, the same woman whose armies he had crushed. But desperation erases old hatred. Margaret wanted her husband restored. Warwick wanted revenge. Their alliance was sealed through marriage between Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, and Margaret's son, Prince Edward. The Red Rose and the Kingmaker had joined forces, and it worked. Warwick invaded England in 1470 with French support. Edward, caught off guard and betrayed again by shifting loyalties, fled into exile with his brother Richard, seeking refuge in Burgundy. Henry VI, feeble, broken and confused, was pulled from the Tower and restored to the throne as a Lancastrian puppet. After nearly a decade of Yorkist rule, England had a new reality. The Kingmaker had undone his own masterpiece. But the war was far from over. Edward wasn't finished, and the throne was not done changing hands. Edward IV was not a man who tolerated exile. When he fled to Burgundy in 1470, he carried humiliation like a torch, and he had every intention of bringing it back to England to burn his enemies. But first, he needed allies. Burgundy, ruled by Charles the Bold, Edward's brother-in-law, had no love for Lancastrian France. Supporting Edward was a convenient way to strike back at the French crown and destabilise their new alliance with Warwick. With Burgundian gold and soldiers behind him, Edward returned to England in 1471, landing on the Yorkshire coast with a bold declaration. He wasn't invading, he was claiming his duchy. A clever lie. It allowed nobles who feared backing a traitor to join him without losing honour, and join him they did. As Edward marched south, men flocked to his banners. Old loyalties reawakened. Discontent with Warwick simmered. Even his treacherous brother George switched sides again, betraying Warwick just as easily as he had betrayed Edward. The Kingmaker's coalition began to fracture. Edward's ultimate goal was simple: reclaim the crown. To do that, he needed London. The city welcomed him with open arms. The people preferred a strong, charismatic king over a resurrected, mentally broken Henry VI. Edward marched straight to the Tower and reclaimed Henry as his prisoner once more. With the passive Lancastrian king secured, Edward turned toward the true threat, Warwick. The confrontation came at Barnet on Easter Sunday, in a fog so thick that armies could barely see their own banners. Confusion swallowed the battlefield. Units accidentally attacked their own allies. Orders vanished into mist. But in that chaos, Edward thrived. His aggressive charge smashed through the Lancastrian lines, and Warwick, the man who made and unmade kings, was struck down while trying to flee the field. The Kingmaker was dead. His era of manipulation ended with a sword in the back, and his body displayed unceremoniously for the public to quell rumours of survival. But Edward had no time to celebrate. Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, had landed in England the very day Warwick fell. The Lancastrian cause was battered, but not broken. A final confrontation loomed, one that would decide the fate of both roses forever. Edward had toppled the Kingmaker. Now he had to finish the war, and nothing, not fog, betrayal, or prophecy, would stand in his way. With Warwick dead, Edward IV had crushed the mastermind behind his downfall. But the war itself still breathed Margaret of Anjou, relentless and undeterred, had finally returned to England with her son, Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir. She refused to surrender her dynasty. She refused to accept Yorkist rule. And she refused to let her husband's fragile mind be the end of her family's legacy. Her plan was simple and desperate. Reach Wales, gather reinforcements, and raise a Lancastrian army strong enough to strike back. But Edward was faster. Fueled by momentum and vengeance, he raced across England with an army determined to end the conflict once and for all. Every step he took closed the window of hope, for Lancaster Margaret's forces were exhausted long before they reached Welsh support. Forced to turn and fight at Tewkesbury in May 1471, she made her final stand. The battlefield stretched across rolling fields and hedgerows, beautiful terrain for a picnic, catastrophic for retreat. Edward arranged his army with discipline, placing seasoned Yorkist captains at every advantage point. This wasn't the tentative Edward of earlier years. This was a hardened, confident warrior king determined to finish the story his father never could. The Lancastrians struck first, hoping to break the Yorkist line with a fierce assault. For a moment, it nearly worked. But Edward counterattacked with brutal precision, sending his brother Richard of Gloucester, young, deadly, and ambitious, into the fray. The Yorkist advance shredded Lancastrian formations with frightening speed. Then disaster struck the Red Rose completely. A hidden lane behind the battlefield turned into a death trap. As Lancastrian troops tried to retreat, cavalry crashed into them, cutting them down in droves. Men fell in heaps, trampled or slaughtered as they fled. The Lancastrian line dissolved, their morale shattered. Prince Edward, the last hope of the House of Lancaster, was captured. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the result was the same. The 18-year-old heir was killed, his blood marking the death of Lancastrian succession. Margaret of Anjou was taken prisoner shortly after, her fury finally broken. With the prince dead and Henry VI locked in the Tower, Lancaster no longer had a future. Tewkesbury wasn't just a defeat, it was extinction. Days later, Henry VI died mysteriously, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. The Lancastrian line was finished. After 20 years of bloodshed, England had one king, one dynasty, and one direction, or so it seemed. After Tewkesbury, England seemed finally at peace. Edward IV stood unchallenged, young, victorious, and charismatic. The Lancastrian line had been shattered. King Henry VI was dead in the Tower. Prince Edward was gone. Margaret of Anjou was broken in captivity. The Red Rose had wilted, but the Wars of the Roses were never about a single branch of a family. They were about ambition, survival, and the dangerous vacuum a weak monarchy creates, and the seeds of the next conflict were already rooted in the very dynasty that had supposedly triumphed. Edward's reign stabilised England, until his sudden death in 1483 at only 40 years old. His heir, the 12-year-old Edward V, never even had time to warm the throne. The boy and his younger brother were taken into custody by their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the same Richard who had fought fiercely at Tewkesbury. What happened next remains one of history's darkest mysteries. The princes were lodged in the Tower of London for their safety, and then disappeared. Most believe they were murdered, almost certainly with Richard's approval. And with the boys gone, Richard declared himself King Richard III. But Richard's moment of power was short and haunted. The Yorkist faction fractured. Many nobles, horrified by the disappearance of the princes, abandoned Richard. The people whispered that the Tower was cursed. Across the Channel, exiled Lancastrians sensed opportunity. And among them was a young, cautious, politically useful claimant, Henry Tudor. Henry had only a thin blood claim to Lancaster through his mother, but he had something much more important. Backers, disaffected Yorkists, surviving Lancastrians, French supporters, and nobles disgusted by Richard's ruthlessness all rallied behind him. For the first time, England wasn't simply choosing between red or white, it was choosing someone new. In 1485, Henry landed in Wales and marched toward destiny. At Bosworth Field, Richard III met him in battle. Richard charged with legendary bravery, so fiercely that chroniclers later said he fought like a boar driven mad. But bravery couldn't save him. He was surrounded, unhorsed, and killed. A crown, literally, was found in the mud and placed on Henry's head. He became King Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. To heal the nation, Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses into the Tudor rose, ending the war not with victory alone, but with symbolic reconciliation. After 30 years of bloodshed, betrayal, and shifting loyalties, England finally had peace. But only because every other claimant was dead.